I'm Dave Gwatkin. I'm one of the two presenters in the session on monitoring, equity monitoring for universal coverage programs. I'm a senior fellow at the Results for Development Institute in Washington, and as some of you may know, a refugee from the World Bank. Now, I want to focus on two questions, and then we'll come to a conclusion, perhaps. The first question is, can universal coverage programs be inequitable? And the second question, are, in fact, universal coverage programs inequitable? Now, the first of these two questions was one. The presentation is really one that's made in moderate annoyance at an accusation leveled at me for some years. The charge being that I was a targeting person, which was correct, and that targeting, although I dislike the term intensely, I would prefer affirmative action or focus, which I think is more accurate. But the argument was that universal coverage is far more equitable than targeting for two reasons. One is that targeting implies giving higher value to the health of poor people than to better off people, whereas we really ought to treat everybody as equal. And second, that it implied unequal services. Services for poor people were inevitably poor services, and everybody ought to be getting the same service. And I want to make the argument to start that whereas that an adoption of a universal coverage approach does not release one from the need to focus on the poor, at least to some degree. Now, if and when one achieves the objective of universal universal coverage, I think everyone would agree, including me, that it's highly equitable and the optimal situation. But it takes a while to get to universal coverage if we want to be at all realistic. And second, there's by no means assurance that we can get there. Anybody here old enough to remember Health for All by the year 2000? I don't think we ever knew exactly what that was, but there seems to be general agreement that whatever it was, we didn't get there. And that was about it's been, 35 years since that happened. So we really got to worry about the transition. Now, during the transition, groups can rise at different rates, and there are reasons that I'll go into for suspecting that the, quote, natural, unquote, course of events will lead to upper income groups or upper economic groups progressing initially faster than lower income groups, so that you could well have a period of increased inequality on the way to universal coverage. And if you get stuck somewhere in the middle, as we lose enthusiasm for universal coverage or Health for All and move on to some other particular interest at the moment, the inequities or inequalities will end up being worse than they are at the start. Now, let me just add parenthetically that I'm going to be using inequalities and inequities interchangeably on the assumption that inequalities that exist in health are, by and large, inequitable. Now, the way that this can work in theory and to some extent empirically, is through the working of what's called the inverse equity hypothesis that came up, Cesar Victoria and some colleagues came up with that in the year 2000. It's a longitudinal equivalent of the inverse care law developed some years earlier. And the idea is that as new health programs come along, they're taken up first by the better off and then trickle down to the poor. And so that there are initial increases in there are initial increases in inequity of coverage, and inequities improve only, inequalities, I got that all mixed up, that equity comes along only later. Now, Cesar illustrated this point by several examples from Brazil. And I'll illustrate it here. If this is true, the poor will come last in any quest for universal coverage and suffer most if the full attainment of universal coverage goal is delayed or never achieved. Now, illustrate the point through a simple example. Here's a new health intervention, Intervention X, Miracle Intervention X. At first, nobody has it, say ITNs. Stage 1 would be what WHO in one of its World Health Reports called mass deprivation. 25% average coverage. The better off get it first, and they reap the benefit of the gain, and you end up with a concave kind of curve. Then later, and this is an average of 50% coverage, it straightens out as the middle classes catch up. You go from 50 to 75%, and you come up with what's called marginal exclusion, where everybody has the coverage except the very poorest. And then you get to 100%, where everything becomes equal again. Now, if that happens, during the 0 to 25%, here's the percent of the total gain going to the group. Each economic group, the top 20% obviously gains the most. As you go from 25 to 50%, then the middle groups gain the most. The same is true when you go to 50 to 75%, and the really big gains for the poor come only in the last stage. So the moral of the story is if you're going to go for universal coverage, and if you're concerned for equity, be sure that you get there, and be sure that you get there fast. Now, that's just a summary there. Now the question arises, are universal coverage programs, in fact, inequitable? There are lots of hypotheses around in this world, and sometimes they're correct empirically, and sometimes they're not correct. Some of us will perhaps remember the Kuznets hypothesis about income distribution as one of many famous potential examples. So it becomes important to look at the record and see how correct this is. And several of us have been looking at that, several different groups, in two ways. One, cross-sectional, evidence from country comparisons, and second, intertemporal, comparisons in individual countries over time. And we've all been using the same numbers, the same basic data. Child health information, maternal child health information from the demographic and health surveys and the multiple indicator cluster surveys of UNICEF. And we all realize that this is very unsatisfactory because it deals only with maternal child health, not with general child health conditions. But despite that, we all continue to use it because it's there. And it's also about the only thing that's there. Now, the first stage, at least the first stage that I know about, was that a colleague and I, Alex Ergo, developed something that we called an inequality pattern measure and used that to look at comparisons across countries. We were going to call it the Gwatkin Ergo measure, but he wanted to call it the Ergo-Gwatkin measure, so we compromised. It's the inequality pattern measure. Now, the basic idea starts with that diagram I showed earlier. And it's simply, if you'll take the bottom example, the 25 coverage, you simply draw a line from the bottom point to the top point and measure the area under the line as a measure of the degree of curvature in the line. So when you're very low, we arbitrarily assigned a plus value to that. And as you increase and the line straightens out, and you get to the 50% level, that value decreases, becomes 0. And then when you get to the 75% level, we define that as minus. So you go from a high plus level to a high, if the hypothesis is correct, you would expect it to go from a very large plus level to a minus level as overall average coverage levels increase. Now, does that in fact happen? We took a look at DHS data for about 50 inequalities for about, I think it was about 50 countries. Latest available, we did it 3 or 4 years ago. Attended delivery, antenatal care, the standard list. I guess we had 2, 4, 6, 7. And here are the results. I won't deal with it in any great detail, but suffice it to say, the important thing is that the coefficient there on the left, they all have minus signs, showing that indeed, by our measure at least, the equity, inverse equity hypothesis holds true. And they're pretty significant, very significant up top. The only one is ORT use, where there's no significance at all, which is interestingly the one that's one of the ones that is of least use in medical services, and the one that's the highest requires the most intense medical services, which may or may not be of interest. So now, at the time we did this, there weren't really, the idea of measuring inequalities through DHS data was pretty new. So at the time, we didn't have any 2 points in time for that many countries that had not been published. Now, since then, I think it's 3 years ago or so, more and more DH studies have been published, more recent ones, and people have gone back and looked at earlier DHS studies. So you now have 2 major pieces of work looking at time trends in DHS studies and mixed studies over time. And here I've got 2 tables to present the results of 2 of them, 2 of those 2 studies. And they produce a very different picture than did our cross-sectional work earlier. You will see, here's one by Carol Bredenkamp and others at the World Bank using, I think, about 35 or 40. I took only the ones that are positive, that had positive average gains, and that's about 30. And this is a statistically significant decrease in inequality. And you'll see in antenatal care, almost all of them had a statistically significant decrease in inequality. I hasten to add that a statistically significant is not necessarily programmatically significant. Some of these were fairly minor, but the measure used still produced a significant result. Skilled birth assistance is more or less the same result. Immunization, turns out you had a lot with no statistical change, one way or the other, and a few more that did. But rather curiously, to my surprise, this one is produces more neutrals than others. Then we have another second, was published last year, also by Cesar Victoria and colleagues, who developed the inverse equity hypothesis. And this is my tabulation of their numbers, but you'll see it gives a roughly similar picture. They did separate analyses, their own analyses of the DHS data, separate from the World Bank group, and they too had about 30 or so. Skilled birth assistance, also in about, about 3/4 of the cases, I guess. And measles immunization, almost all pro-poor, somewhat in contrast to the Bredenkamp results. They speculate, by the way, that this might well have been produced by the fact that immunization campaigns during this period increasingly took up mass campaigns. Because they had to get mass campaigns, they were getting high enough average coverage level to get to the rest of the people. They just weren't coming into the clinics. So the programs undertook mass campaigns that went out and reached the poor. The exception was treated bed nets, which was a very new intervention, which average coverage levels were very low. And so they speculate, again, that or argue, in this case, I suppose, that in some cases, for some services, the inverse care hypothesis equity hypothesis is alive and well. So you see a very different pattern across services for those. Now, let's limp toward a conclusion from that. And the question is, what do we make of all this? Cross-sectional data shows you one thing, time series shows you another thing. There are variations with the time series data. In fact, the figures that Adam presented yesterday were somewhat different from the Bredenkamp figures in that map, and, because he used a different indicator of inequality, and he included a slightly different set of countries. Normally one prefers longitudinal data or cross-country data, and I guess I'd have to say that's true in this case as well. But remember, even different ways of looking at the longitudinal data in this case can pose at least somewhat different conclusions. And second, there's some dirty little secrets in that longitudinal data. One of them being that if you want to get any kind of coherent results, you have to use the last survey and the first survey only when they're about 10 years apart. If you got a middle survey, you can often find them going up and down like that, the inequality. And you have to argue that that's an aberration, and it's not clear to me there's any base for thinking that middle one is more likely to be an aberration than the first or the end. So there are problems with longitudinal data in this case. So I consider the situation, to describe it very simply in one term, it's a mess. And we really just can't tell. My best guess is that probably, and this is a guess, I wouldn't even dignify it as a hypothesis, sometimes inequality goes up and sometimes it goes down, and we really have no basis for knowing why. So we don't know where we are. And I think that that gets to the conclusion, and we circle back to the question of monitoring. Why is monitoring important? That's when monitoring is really important, when you don't know what the outcome is likely to be. You don't know whether you're going to increase equity in any one setting with confidence or any one program. The only way you can really be sure is to monitor as you go along, and then a willingness to change course as you get there. And that is the message of the morning. Thank you.